There are moments when a single statement from a public figure doesn't just make headlines. It quietly exposes something deeper about the human condition, something most people don't like to talk about out loud. And that is exactly what happened when a well-known political leader said he had been thinking about heaven, about judgment, and about whether his actions on earth might somehow matter beyond this life. Because in that moment, the conversation stopped being political and started becoming unsettlingly personal, almost as if it was aimed directly at the viewer listening right now. And what made it even more striking wasn't just the words themselves, but the reaction that followed, because suddenly journalists, commentators, and everyday people all rushed to interpret what it meant for a man in power to openly connect something like war, peace, and eternal destiny. And that reaction itself reveals something we rarely admit, that most people are far more comfortable discussing politics than they are discussing eternity, even though eternity is the one subject nobody escapes. But here's where things begin to shift in a way that most viewers don't expect. Because hidden inside that entire controversy is not really a story about one man's statement. It is actually a mirror being held up to every single person who heard it, and the uncomfortable question quietly forming underneath everything is this: what if the way we think about goodness is incomplete? And what if blessings from God are not distributed the way most people assume? Because if there is one assumption almost everyone carries without realizing it, it is that blessings are random, or earned through surface-level behavior, or perhaps even luck. But the spiritual tradition that Fardan Reehil was pointing toward suggests something far more structured and far more demanding, because it implies that there are hidden principles governing how divine favor actually enters a person's life, principles that most people walk past every single day without noticing. And the strange part is that the world keeps giving clues about it, but those clues are usually dismissed as coincidences or motivational ideas rather than spiritual mechanics. And so people continue living as if blessings are either delayed rewards or unexplained events, never realizing that there may be a deeper order underneath it all that connects intention, humility, suffering, and even motivation itself. That is why the gospel reflection embedded in Fardan Reehil's teaching becomes so important here, because it shifts attention away from external actions alone and forces the viewer to consider something far more uncomfortable, which is the interior direction behind those actions. Because two people can do the exact same good deed and yet receive completely different spiritual outcomes, and that difference is not visible on the outside. And this is where the first tension begins to build, because if intention matters as much as action, then suddenly life becomes much harder to measure, much harder to justify, and much harder to perform for approval. And that is exactly the point where most people unconsciously resist this kind of teaching, because it removes the illusion that goodness can be performed like a role. But before that idea fully settles, another layer emerges, because the discussion quickly moves toward the concept of judgment and grace, and the tension between what is earned and what is given. And here, the conversation becomes even more complex, because on one hand, there is the clear Christian teaching that salvation comes through grace, not works. But on the other hand, there is the equally strong scriptural emphasis that people are known by their fruits. And that tension is not a contradiction. It is a pressure point. And that pressure point is where the real lesson begins to form, because it suggests that a life aligned with God is not simply about performing correct actions, but about becoming the kind of person from whom correct actions naturally flow. And that distinction changes everything, because it means behavior is no longer the root, it is the result. But then something even more surprising enters the reflection, because the idea of humility is introduced not as a personality trait, but as a spiritual positioning system, almost like a hidden law that determines whether a person is lifted or left unseen. And that idea is reinforced through the parable of choosing the lowest seat at the table, where elevation does not come from self-promotion, but from being willing to remain unimportant in the moment. And this is where the story begins to tighten again, because it is easy to hear that teaching and think it is simply about etiquette or modest behavior. But what if it is actually describing a pattern that repeats across every area of life, including success, recognition, and even spiritual breakthrough, where the people who grasp for visibility end up delaying their own elevation, while those who release it are positioned differently over time. But the deeper implication is still not fully revealed yet, because underneath humility there is something even more foundational being hinted at, and that is motivation itself. Because Father Dan Reehil's reflection keeps returning to this uncomfortable truth that actions can look identical while being driven by completely different internal forces, and those internal forces are what determine whether something becomes spiritually empty or spiritually transformative. And so the viewer is left in a subtle tension, because it raises a question that cannot be easily answered with surface logic. How many of the good things people do in life are actually aimed at God? And how many are quietly aimed at the self, even when they appear virtuous on the outside? That question alone begins to shift the entire direction of the message, because suddenly the focus is no longer on visible behavior, but on invisible intention. And as soon as that shift happens, the narrative opens into something much deeper, because intention is harder to control, harder to fake, and harder to maintain over time. And this is where the idea of blessings begins to take on a different meaning. Because if blessings are tied not just to actions, but to the purity behind those actions, then the entire structure of how people seek favor from life begins to collapse and rebuild itself in a new form. One that is less about achievement and more about alignment. But just as this begins to settle, another example enters the reflection. The kind that seems simple at first, but carries far more weight than expected, because it touches on the difference between doing something for recognition versus doing something for love. And that difference quietly determines whether an act becomes spiritually storing treasure or simply consuming attention. And still, even after all of this, there is a deeper thread being pulled underneath the surface, because the reflection begins to widen into examples of historical saints who lived in a completely different way than modern instinct suggests. People who didn't optimize for comfort, visibility, or safety, but instead moved towards suffering, correction, and service in ways that feel almost alien to contemporary thinking. And the moment those examples appear, something shifts again, because it becomes harder to dismiss the earlier ideas as abstract theology and easier to see them as lived reality, as patterns that have already been tested in history under extreme conditions, where motivation was not theoretical but life-defining. But even then, the message has not fully reached its turning point, because the most important implication is still waiting just ahead, and it is the idea that spiritual growth may not come from adding more to life, but from removing the hidden self-centeredness that quietly attaches itself to everything, even the most noble intentions. And that realization creates a kind of internal discomfort, because it suggests that the real obstacle is not lack of knowledge or lack of opportunity, but something far more subtle, something that disguises itself as ambition, responsibility, or even virtue. And that is precisely where the next layer of the teaching begins to open, revealing that what appears to be progress on the outside may still be stagnation on the inside if the motivation is misaligned. And as this thought deepens, the entire framework of receiving God's blessings begins to feel less like a simple formula and more like a process of inner purification that most people are not aware they are even supposed to undergo, which raises an even more unsettling question about how many people are unknowingly blocking the very things they are praying for. But before that question can fully resolve, the reflection begins to shift again, and this time toward a contrast that is almost unavoidable, because it compares a life centered on self-image with a life centered on service. And the difference between those two paths becomes increasingly sharp the longer it is observed, as if both are producing results, but only one is producing depth. And just when it feels like the idea has reached its limit, a final thread begins to emerge, subtle but persistent, suggesting that the true nature of blessings might not be about receiving external changes at all, but about becoming internally capable of recognizing and sustaining them without distortion. And that is where everything begins to move toward a much larger realization that has not yet been fully revealed. And that is where everything begins to move toward a much larger realization that has not yet been fully revealed. Because if blessings are not just external outcomes and not just rewards for behavior, then what exactly is being adjusted when a person's life suddenly shifts from confusion to clarity, from struggle to unexpected opening, from delay to breakthrough? And that question sits in the background as the next layer of the teaching begins to unfold. Because the reflection doesn't move toward complexity for its own sake. It moves toward something simpler but far more demanding. And that is the idea that the spiritual life is not primarily about accumulation, but alignment. And alignment always begins in places that people usually overlook, especially the hidden intentions behind ordinary decisions that seem too small to matter. And this is where the first of the deeper principles begins to quietly surface, not as a rule, but as a pattern that repeats across every saintly life and every transformed life in Scripture. And that pattern is that God does not primarily respond to performance. He responds to orientation, meaning the direction of the heart matters more than the appearance of the action. But even that idea can be misunderstood because it can still be reduced into something mechanical, as if people can simply aim correctly and receive results. But the teaching refuses to stay that shallow because it immediately pushes deeper into something more uncomfortable, which is that true orientation requires purification. And purification almost always involves the removal of ego-driven motives that feel natural. And that is where the internal resistance begins. Because most people assume their intentions are already good enough, or at least acceptable, but the reflection keeps pressing into the uncomfortable possibility that mixed motives are far more common than pure ones, and that mixture is exactly what creates spiritual inconsistency, where a person experiences moments of clarity but cannot sustain them. And so the narrative shifts again, this time toward a more difficult truth, that blessings are often not missing because God is absent, but because something within the human heart is still competing for control, still demanding recognition, still seeking outcome without surrender. And that internal competition quietly disrupts what could otherwise flow freely. But then something unexpected enters the reflection, because instead of making the message heavier, it begins to simplify it again, almost like peeling away noise. And it suggests that one of the hidden secrets is not complexity at all, but sincerity. The kind of sincerity that removes performance, even from prayer, even from service, even from goodness itself. And that leads to a subtle but powerful shift in focus, because suddenly the question is no longer what am I doing, but why am I doing it when no one is watching? And that question has a way of stripping away illusions very quickly, because it cannot be answered through public identity, only through private truth. And as that thought settles, the reflection moves toward another layer that many people overlook, which is that suffering itself is not always a disruption to blessings, but sometimes the very environment where blessings are formed. Because suffering removes certain illusions that comfort preserves, and in that removal, clarity begins to appear. But this is not a comfortable idea, because it challenges the instinct to interpret difficulty as abandonment, when in fact the teaching suggests it may sometimes be refinement, and refinement always feels like loss before it feels like gain, which is why so many people misread the process while it is happening. And now the reflection begins to connect earlier examples of saints and service to this idea, because what looked like extraordinary sacrifice in their lives begins to appear less like extreme behavior and more like a different kind of perception, where they were able to see value in what others avoided and presence in what others rejected. And that contrast becomes more important as the teaching continues, because it suggests that receiving God's blessings may depend not only on what a person does, but on what a person is willing to approach without self-protection. Meaning the areas of life where ego usually retreats are often the same areas where transformation begins. But just as that idea starts to form, the reflection introduces another tension, because it brings back the idea of humility again, but this time not as lowering oneself artificially, but as living without the constant need to defend status. And that difference is subtle but profound, because one is performance while the other is freedom. And as that distinction becomes clearer, the teaching begins to circle back toward everyday life, because it implies that blessings are not only tied to dramatic spiritual moments, but to ordinary interactions where pride, irritation, patience, and silence constantly reveal what is actually guiding the heart. And in that sense, even small moments become spiritually significant, because they expose whether a person is acting from reaction or from grounded intention. And reaction always pulls attention back to self, while grounded intention quietly redirects it outward. But the reflection doesn't allow the viewer to settle into that idea too quickly, because it introduces another uncomfortable layer, which is that even good religious activity can become self-centered if it is not anchored in love. And that means external participation is not enough to guarantee internal transformation. And this is where the message begins to intensify again, because it suggests that it is possible to be active in faith while still misaligned in heart. And that condition creates a kind of spiritual frustration where effort increases but peace does not. And so the teaching begins to point toward a different kind of measure, one that cannot be easily tracked. And that is the presence of interior peace that is not dependent on outcomes, because that peace indicates something about alignment that success alone cannot guarantee. But then the reflection takes another turn, because it brings in the idea of gratitude not as a polite practice, but as a structural shift in perception, where a person begins to recognize what is already present instead of only what is missing. And that shift begins to change how life is interpreted at its most basic level. And that is important, because without gratitude, even blessings can be misread as accidents. And when blessings are misread, they are rarely received fully, because recognition is part of reception, and what is not recognized is often not integrated. But even gratitude is not presented as the final layer, because the reflection keeps pushing deeper into motivation itself, and it begins to suggest that the highest form of spiritual alignment is when action, intention, and love for God are no longer separate categories, but become a single movement of the heart. And at that point, something subtle changes in the entire tone of the message, because it is no longer about trying harder, but about becoming quieter internally, so that what is false can lose its influence and what is true can begin to shape behavior naturally. But just when it seems like the core idea has been revealed, another tension appears, because the reflection reminds the viewer that transformation is not instant, and that the process often involves repeated correction, repeated awareness, and repeated surrender of the same inner patterns that return in different forms. And that repetition can feel discouraging if it is misunderstood, but the teaching reframes it as formation, where each return of the same struggle is not failure, but an opportunity to refine intention more deeply than before. And as this idea settles, the narrative begins to connect everything back to the original question of blessings, because now blessings no longer appear as isolated events, but as the gradual result of a life being reshaped internally into greater coherence. But even that is not the final point, because there is still one more layer emerging beneath it all. and it is the unsettling possibility that many people are not actually far from blessings, but simply misaligned with the conditions that allow them to recognize or sustain them without distortion. And that realization creates a final tension, because it suggests that the greatest shift may not come from asking for more, but from becoming capable of receiving what is already being offered. And that changes the entire direction of the search. And right at the edge of that realization, the teaching begins to point toward the final secret that has not yet been fully revealed. And right at the edge of that realization, the teaching begins to point toward the final secret that has not yet been fully revealed. Because if the problem is not always lack of blessing, but lack of alignment to receive it, then the real question becomes much more uncomfortable. What exactly has to change inside a person so that what God is already willing to give is no longer blocked, delayed, or misread? And that question doesn't stay theoretical for long, because the reflection immediately shifts into something more direct, almost like it is speaking to the viewer personally now, suggesting that the hidden barrier is rarely external circumstance, but internal resistance that disguises itself as logic, timing, or even spiritual caution. And this is where everything begins to tighten into a final pattern, because the teaching keeps circling back to one consistent truth in different forms, that God's blessings are not withheld randomly, but they are often unable to fully manifest in a life that is still centered on self-preservation, self-image, or self-exaltation, even in subtle ways that feel harmless. But instead of leaving that as a condemnation, the reflection begins to reveal something more hopeful, because it suggests that awareness itself is already the beginning of transformation. And the moment a person can see mixed motivation without justifying it, something inside begins to loosen. And that loosening is important because it shows that spiritual growth is not only about adding new virtues, but about releasing internal attachments that quietly compete with love. And those attachments are often so familiar that they feel like identity rather than resistance. And as that idea deepens, the reflection returns once more to the idea of humility, but now it is no longer about position or behavior. It is about truthfulness before God, where a person stops presenting a curated version of themselves, even in prayer, and begins to stand without disguise. And that kind of honesty creates a different kind of interior space, because it removes the need to constantly manage perception. And when perception management disappears, clarity begins to increase. Not because life becomes easier, but because distortion begins to fade. But the message does not stop there, because it then moves toward a subtle but powerful idea that one of the most overlooked secrets to receiving God's blessings is consistency of intention, meaning not perfection, but stability of direction, where a person keeps returning to love of God and love of neighbor, even after failure, distraction, or pride. And that is where the earlier examples of saints suddenly become more than historical stories, because they now function like evidence of what sustained alignment looks like over time, not because they were flawless, but because their orientation repeatedly returned to God even when life was chaotic. And this is where the teaching becomes more practical in a hidden way, because it implies that transformation is not built on isolated moments of inspiration, but on repeated small choices that slowly retrain what the heart naturally gravitates toward. But even that is not the final layer, because the reflection begins to move towards something even more subtle, which is that many people unknowingly separate spiritual life from daily life, treating faith as something added on top of existence rather than something that reshapes how existence is lived. And that separation creates fragmentation, where a person can appear spiritually engaged in one setting and completely reactive in another. And that inconsistency is often what prevents deeper peace from taking root. So the message begins to unify those domains again, suggesting that the real goal is integration, where prayer, action, intention, and daily behavior begin to reflect the same internal center rather than competing identities. And as that idea settles, The reflection returns to the concept of judgment, but now it is no longer presented as something distant or fear-based, but as something that naturally evaluates authenticity, not just outcomes. And that shifts the entire emotional tone of the teaching from anxiety to responsibility. But even responsibility is not the final destination, because the reflection keeps moving toward love as the ultimate organizing principle, suggesting that when love for God becomes primary, many of the internal conflicts that previously felt complicated begin to simplify themselves over time. And that simplicity is not instant, because the teaching repeatedly reminds that the human heart resists change that removes ego control. But over time, repeated surrender creates a new pattern that feels less forced and more natural. And this is where the final tension builds again, because it suggests that the difference between stagnation and spiritual growth is not always dramatic behavior change, but subtle internal reordering that most people never consciously observe until the results begin to appear. But before that idea fully resolves, the reflection returns to the idea of blessings one last time, and now it reframes them not as rewards that come after effort, but as effects that emerge when a life becomes less resistant to God's movement. And that reframing is critical, because it means the focus is no longer on trying to force outcomes, but on removing what blocks flow. And that shift alone changes how struggle is interpreted, no longer as rejection, but as process. And then, almost quietly, the teaching brings everything back to the core question that has been building since the beginning. Not what is God willing to give, but what kind of person is able to receive without distortion, without ego, and without turning the gift back into self-glory. And right there, the final secret begins to take shape, because it is not a technique, not a formula, and not a shortcut, but a way of being where intention is purified enough that actions naturally become aligned. And aligned actions become channels rather than obstacles. And as that realization settles, everything that came before starts to connect. The humility, the saints, the intention, the suffering, the correction, all pointing toward one consistent truth that keeps reappearing in different forms, that God's blessings are not hidden, but they are encountered in proportion to how fully a person's heart stops competing with them.